So before we get started with the film, we're going to have a few comments from Troy Duster. So Troy Duster is Chancellor Professor here at UC Berkeley. Troy has been a leading voice on these offering these types of offering, I should say, the public a sense of what these technologies might mean and their impact. He's been a big part of the conversation over several decades, and we invited him here to introduce the film and share a few thoughts.
Okay, so I've been asked, as you noted, to make a few remarks to introduce the film. And I'm going to try to situate it in historical and social context by saying very broadly, all of human history, humans, for the most part, have been born into their circumstance and they stay there. Nomadic societies, agrarian societies, feudal societies, you name it. You're born a serf or a peasant, you're born a farmer, you're born a nomad or something, and that's where you stay. So what's happened in the last 3 to 4 centuries is extraordinary and unusual in human history. Beginning with the Mercantile Revolution, what happened was people began to move across categories. In the feudal society, you were born into a landed aristocracy, or you were a serf or a peasant. And that was the end of the story in terms of your social mobility, something social scientists call ascribed versus achieved status. So that's the frame. Beginning with, again, about the 17th century, we begin to see movement, something called social mobility across class societies. And for most of you, that's taken for granted now. But I want to emphasize how unusual it is, not just in Western society, but across the globe. I'm not suggesting that open societies mean that people get into categories and move across them. If you're born to poverty, your chance of staying in poverty are very, very high. If you're born to the aristocracy or to privilege and wealth, that's where you're likely to stay most of your life. I don't mean to mention the Trump family, but since that's an issue in terms of who gets where versus who might move across class lines, it's extraordinary how little mobility there has been given the ideology of open mobility. So now we come to the film, Gattaca. And what you will see is a framing of the problem in terms of mobility, social mobility, moving across categories, occupations, and what the limits and barriers are based upon, of course, one's genetic code, one's DNA, thus Gattaca. And what I suggest that we focus at least in part on during the film is the ways in which the various actors conceptualize this issue. To what extent there is, for example, individual resistance versus social resistance, a category which is current, the idea of resistance. Well, what form does it take? Is it simply a matter of individuals who have talent, ability, skill, and there are barriers to it based upon DNA? Do you see anything in the film that looks like increased social consciousness, increasing notions of activism on the part of more than one person who's feeling that he or she can't move across social categories? At the end of the film, there will be a panel, and this and other issues, this issue will be taken up. So I was given 5 minutes, and my 5 minutes are up. So I enjoy the film.
My name is Karen Nakamura. I'm the Past Chair in Disability Studies and Professor of Anthropology here at UC Berkeley, and I'm very pleased to have been given the role of moderating this panel discussion with 3 absolutely incredible leaders in bioethics and disability. And so I thought the initial format I'm going to do is I'm going to, in lieu of introducing everyone at once, start people off with an introduction and a question and then move on. And then we're going to launch into more a standard panel discussion type, and then finally segue to questions from the audience. So keep your questions in your head as we move along. So let me start off with Professor Troy Duster, who started us off at the beginning of the film. And Professor Duster is the Chancellor Professor in Sociology. He's a Guggenheim recipient, author of many, many books. One of the ones that's most appropriate to this today's talk is the book Backdoor to Eugenics, which talks about how new gene technologies have been affecting how we think about race, racialized discrimination, gender and gender-based discrimination. But the question I wanted to start you off with was, at the beginning you had talked about how we're in a new moment of mobility and social mobility that was rather unique, that we can now rise or in some ways fall out of the social status of our birth. And this film takes an interesting twist on it because it introduces the genetic component. But I was thinking when you were talking about that, about other societies, such as in China, where in China there's a long period in which the civil service exam served as this mechanism for social mobility for everyone, and how right now we also have introduced, this is just in some ways this genetic testing is just another proxy for a whole slew of other types of testing that we've been doing, No Child Left Behind, the SATs, ACTs, everything else. And is genetic testing in some ways different from other types of standardized testing that have become the regime for the last 50 years?
Well, I didn't mean to suggest that we are an open society where people move across social classes with any ease. Indeed, I was emphasizing the recency of that framework, that for the most part, human societies have not permitted that. So the ideology of an open society is that people can and should achieve their status as opposed to an ascribed status. So that's the framework. Now what this film does is to reintroduce the whole idea that you're born with your destiny. And the opening, 5 minutes is all about how this family wants to have just a normal child, and then they're told, no, you can't have a normal child, you have to have a child with a certain number of attributes. Well, okay, so now we have what's called CRISPR, and most of the audience will know what that is. It's a new technology which was futuristic even a decade ago, which now is being discussed openly and on this campus. One of the 2 or 3 leaders of the CRISPR technological revolution is a member of the faculty here. Okay. So here's the framework. What this film tries to do, and it does it with some ease, but often it gets foggy. It says that you can go into the DNA and determine who's who, and that is a defining characteristic of where you will be in this social order. Now, earlier this week, there was an article that was published, which I thought was extraordinary, because what it did was to say, you know, when you're given a sample of your DNA, you're told it's possibly anonymous, unless you disclose, unless you want to be disclosed. But the article this week said, no, you can actually, one can now with new technologies, determine who it is based upon their genome. So what seemed futuristic 20 years ago, with respect to putting your finger down there, is this who you are? Well, this new technology, even before we get to CRISPR, which I think we're bound to address, gets us into the zone of, you think you contribute your DNA to Ancestry.com or 23andMe? You think it's anonymous? No, even today, they are able to find out with only a little bit of information about you what that DNA actually portends in terms of who you quote are. So I don't know whether that's responsive to your question, but it seems to me that the film actually predicted 20 years ago the capacity of the DNA technology to determine individuals. And of course, we won't get into the forensic science part of it, but I'll just say what's happened in forensics is a claims making that with just 13 loci in the DNA, they can match and determine whether or not your sample at the scene of the crime matches. And many people have been put in prison and some have gone to their death based upon this connection. That's 13 loci. That's 1990 technology. The current technology is moving so fast that we're going to move into a scene more like Gattaca than we could have imagined 20 years ago.
Well, that's an interesting point, and we are going to go hopefully into both the forensics as well as the implications of gene editing. So our next panelist is Rosemarie Garland-Thomson, who is perhaps one of the, if not the most preeminent bioethicist in terms of disability studies. Normally a professor at Emory University, is spending out his sabbatical, which is quite wonderful. And the question I had is related, you had mentioned right now you're working on a piece related to the notion of the healthy baby and how the healthy baby is used as the sort of pivot point around many debates around bioethics. And so, as Professor Dusto was mentioning, one of the key early moments in the film is when Vincent, as a newborn, gets blood typed and immediately discarded, rendered invalid. And so I was wondering how your current thoughts about the use of that. But as he says, normally he would have been a healthy baby, 10 fingers, 10 toes. In Japan, we say someone born with all 5 limbs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so I was wondering how your piece might react to Gattaca in that sense.
Well, the film, of course, is remarkably prescient because that scene when they do a very quick whole genome sequencing on the newborn is something that was only fictional at the time the film was made in 1997. We can easily do that now. We don't have whole genome sequencing quite as a requirement, a screening requirement for newborns, but we can do that at every stage of the procreative process. We don't do all of it, but we can, and very soon there will be important conversations and decisions made about whether we will do that and what we will do with the information that comes from it. So there are a couple of things about that that's important. One is that we don't have any really robust conversations or decision-making protocols in place for who it is that determines how we distribute and use that information. So eugenics, as it's being practiced right now, is practiced most assiduously, most aggressively in this, what I call the procreative process, which begins now with CRISPR at the pre-individual level and extends from something like preconception genetic counseling through the embryonic stage when we can do in vitro fertilization and we can select for and against certain embryos. We saw that in the film. Do you want a boy? Do you want a girl? What color of eyes? This sort of futuristic scenario in this film is absolutely, without question, achievable now. It's not done entirely, but we don't have very many regulations or protocols about doing it, and it is driven primarily through the technology companies and it's market driven at this point. So it's the traits that we test for and we look for that are determined by commerce now. So that's actually something to worry about in terms of carrying out what we sometimes call now the new eugenics. Sometimes that's called the soft eugenics. It's understood as being different from the kind of eugenics that was state-sponsored. This is more commercially sponsored. I like to call it velvet eugenics. But there's much more to say about eugenics.
And I personally find the fact that Gattaca is a private company just one of the most prescient elements of the state is really withdrawn in this piece. It's really private corporations. But that then leads me to my third panelist, Osagie Obasogie, who is the Haas Distinguished Chair in Health Disparities and Professor of Bioethics here at UC Berkeley. Your most recent book was Blinded by Sight, Seeing Grace Through the Eyes of the Blind, thinking through the legal implications of what it means to be colorblind, and through the metaphor of the loss of sight. But one of the questions I had for you, and this links directly to what Rosemarie Garland-Thomson was just talking about, was that Gattaca seems so prescient. And it was made 20 years ago, and 20 years ago it seemed cutting edge, and all these technologies are things that we were on the verge of thinking through. And what always surprises me is that now 20 years later, it still seems so prescient and on the verge. And I wonder in some ways how it has managed to keep that timelessness, and whether in 20 years from now, we will either view it as suddenly dated, or in 20 years we will still think that, oh boy, this is us. Is Gattaca always sometime, as it says in the beginning, sometime in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point. So I think there's layers to answer this question. So one, it's just a beautiful film, right? The aesthetics of Gattaca is kind of the kind of mid-century modern vibe. It's timeless, and I think that's a key element to making it feel as if it's always fresh in our minds, because it uses a kind of visual narrative that always seems it's a visual narrative that's popular in our minds in terms of how we understand kind of clean spaces and open spaces, and kind of I'm always struck by the double helix staircase, right? It's just so symbolic, and it's so rich. So there's just a lot of eye candy in the film. I think other aspects of the film is that, we tend to think of Gattaca as a film about technology, but in many ways it's a film about human connection and how technology can disrupt these human connections that we think of as being, in a sense, pre-technology. But technology is always mediating these relationships, whether it's a telephone, whether it's a television, the iPhone. And in this film, it is, reproductive technologies. And I think what makes Gattaca attractive is that we're given a glimpse into how the wide use of these technologies may fundamentally alter parent-child relationships. So we see the different ways that Vincent and his brother are treated at a young age because of these technologies. It mediates or changes the relationship between two people who are dating, right? So that kind of movie booth where people kind of surreptitiously take their partners or prospective partners' DNA there to figure out this is a worthwhile time investment because of whether or not they have the right genetic background, right? So here technology is changing the way we court, it's changing the way we parent, it's changing our friendships, the way we work with one another. And I think what makes the film attractive is that it gets us to think about, well, is this the type of society that we want? We tend to think of, particularly American society, we think of these issues such as parent-child relationships and friendships and things of that nature being driven by more, shall we say, involuntary experiences, right? You just kind of meet somebody and you fall in love, or you are a parent to a child, you have a natural bond to them. And this film is showing that all these things are contingent in many ways upon new developments, and it forces the audience to ask, well, is this a good thing or is this a bad thing? And I think that is a perennial question that I imagine 20 years from now we'll be asking in new and different ways.
One of the questions I had was the recent emergence of technologies such as 23andMe have, and I think all of your responses touched on this a little bit, the notion of genetic determinism. When we receive the pie chart back and it tells us that we are 23% Irish and 40% West German and so forth, that seems to mean something. And the racialized categories within 23andMe seem to mean something, and the statistical predetermination of susceptibility to diseases means something. I was wondering if any of you wanted to respond to this notion of the categorization of human beings done through new gene typing technologies.
I did want to say something about that. I was really struck in seeing the film by how seeing or visuality operated in this new regime of genetic identity, because the way, that creepy way, that Gattaca was filled with these robot-like people who had these odd outfits on, how much they all looked exactly alike. And there was racial diversity, if you will, and gender diversity, but there was no genetic diversity at Gattaca. And it led me to think about the role of visuality in social systems that we've always had, that are based on a kind of reading of physical traits in order to justify systems of exclusion or exploitation, and that we have in the past used external visual markers of human beings, things like skin pigmentation, or size, or morphology, or the traits that we think of as the gender distinctions, that are all readable, visually readable on the body in one way or another. And what seems really different and interesting about this new genetic system is that it's all interior. And although there was a manifestation in their, weirdly alikeness, that what really determined your value or your place in the system was totally hidden and inside a body and only accessible through technology. So that allows us to, build products and make markets around technology as a way to identify where we are one another in this system. And that seems really different and new.
Professor Dusty,
Yeah, I'm sort of interested in audience participation in this question. Could I have a show of hands of those who have sent in their sample to some company?
Oh, wow. So to people, about 1 in 8 people, I think, have raised their hand.
Okay. So some of you are ashamed because the technology's been out there for a while now. At the time of the film, it was not there. But if you turn on your television set, many of these programs say, I thought I was 22%, or I thought I was this, and now I discovered I better go fly to this part of the world because that's my ancestry. It is smoke and mirrors. Why? Because the sampling procedure is closed and only open to a particular part of the, what should we call it? It's private sector. It's the term for it, I've forgotten the term. It means you can't have access to it. So it's proprietary, right? And so a company can say that we think you're 18% Irish and 24% and so on. But in fact, you have no access to the sampling procedure. And the idea that one can have 100% of anything is a transparent fiction. It's a fiction. Let's take the whole notion of Native American. 480 different tribes in the tribal council. These companies can't even sample, if they could, they wouldn't sample even 30 or 40. And then what would they sample? And what would be the parameters? So the whole idea that's now fusing into our consciousness is that you can send in a sample of your DNA and you'll get back some precise version of percent ancestry. And I'm struck by how many of my educated friends take this to be a serious enterprise that can give them a real sense of proportional ancestry.
There's something that you wrote on that I wanted to touch upon it, which was the use of racialized data to argue, for example, African Americans are more susceptible to sickle cell or to prostate cancer, or and the marketing of drugs that were then targeted based on this notion of a racialized gene pool.
Well, that's a complicated topic. I mean, we do have in California and a good part of the country what's called a postnatal screen. So every newborn is screened, and a lot of it is with respect to DNA. So sickle cell, spina bifida, alpha-fetoprotein. Okay, so that's postnatal, and that's not an issue because the child's already born, except that, and here's where I'm in favor of certain aspects of the postnatal screen. If you know that the child has beta thalassemia at age 3 or 4 weeks, or sickle cell, you can actually intervene in ways which are productive. So I'm not opposed to postnatal screening. The problem comes when, as in the film, people have a different interpretation of the meaning of that screen. So, I mean, I don't want to say more about that right now, but I think in the exchange with the audience, we should get into how people's images of newborn and newborn screening affects their conception of the child.
Well, I think along the lines, one of the things we tend, when you have the conversation around eugenics, and this film in particular, we tend to focus on what it means to screen for certain traits at conception to produce certain children. And I think that's one level to have the eugenics conversation, but I also want to have a broader conversation about the ideological impact of these technologies. And more importantly, we tend to have this idea that the notion of eugenics went away after World War II. That is, that eugenics was a problem in the early 20th century. We fought a big war, we realized how horrific the ideology was, and afterwards we learned all that it went away. And that narrative is incorrect on its own terms, but what it also fails to appreciate is how eugenic ideologies became embedded in how we understand social reality, or put differently, how the quantification of social life became normalized. So, for example, whenever one of my friends has a child, they get measured, we always talk about their growth in terms of these their 80th percentile of X, 90th percentile of Y, right? So here we're kind of quantifying the ability and future of children in these terms that are linked to the genetic conceptions that were created in years past. And so I think it's important to understand that when we're talking about the role of eugenics in these conversations, it's not only the technology of screening, but it's also how we've come to accept quantification as the accurate predictor of human worth. Whether we're talking about screening technologies, whether we're talking about big data, which is kind of the big buzzword in terms of how we understand the collection of data and analysis of data, that when we understand that these quantitative measures are by definition the most accurate measures to the exclusion of more humanistic or qualitative endeavors, that limits the possibility of humanity in very, very troubling ways.
Well, I think part of the way that this movie aligns the eugenic conversation is that there's almost no focus on negative eugenics, sterilization, or the prevention of the birth of undesirables. It's simply that those who are rich can produce valids, those who are poor can produce invalids, and there's no sense that society is preventing the invalids from breeding with each other. And which is, in our current moment, a recurring theme, right, that people on welfare are having too many children, etc., that we need to sterilize inmates in psychiatric institutions, or we need to sterilize people on welfare, and so forth. And so this notion that it's all positive eugenics muddies our mind, and I'm wondering, especially Rosemarie, how you think of, what is the story here when we have this shift to, of course, well, why wouldn't we want the best baby or the best children?
Well, the language of the best and the worst, of course, is a very prevalent language in some sectors of bioethics now. Utilitarian bioethicists often talk about the obligation to have the best children. But one of the things I was thinking about is the place of the so-called invalids. Because there was definitely in the film two levels of society that were based on not just genetics, but phenotypes as well. And I was thinking about the interesting situation, if you will, of Eugene, who had become disabled, and his disability, at least in the film, functioned as disqualifying all the rest of his excellent profile of characteristics. And the film, I really wasn't sure what it was doing in that respect, but what I did notice that was interesting is that all of the places, all of the settings in the film, Gattaca and that condo, were completely inaccessible, as was the nightclub. There was no public transportation. They drove around those funny little Lada-like cars. And so no one was riding an accessible bus. And there were no elevators or nothing. It was totally inaccessible. So the world was being built for the valids and not the invalids. And of course, Eugene ends up being an example of the fact that we will all become disabled throughout life. And the world could not accommodate him in any way because it was built entirely for the valids. So that's one of the cautionary parts of the tale, is that we will always have people who need to have an accessible built world. And if the valids supposedly have too much, if the world's built too much for the valids alone, then this will increase discrimination against those of us who need an accessible built environment. And Eugene was a great example of that. So we have here, for example, just in this room, a space that is compliant, but not entirely accessible. And it becomes illustrative of the need to think through investing our resources in making a built world that will accommodate the widest possible users in the most effective way, rather than trying to shape people in some way. So we want to shape the world to fit the people in it, rather than shaping the people to fit some unlivable world.
I just wanted to make a quick comment to pick up on the notion of how positive eugenics is sometimes a subterranean feature of our consciousness. It has to do with the fact that 1 in 6 couples, approximately, is infertile. And so in that large population of people who would like to have fertility, they go through a process where it's very expensive, $20,000, $25,000 per moment in which you try to do the in vitro fertilization. So this means that there is actually a commercial interest in this topic. And some of you know this, but let me just put it out there. There is a stratification system with respect to women's eggs. And you can go online, and you can see that if you're a Princeton graduate, you can command about $30,000 per egg. If you're from a community college, it's a little more like 15, maybe 12,000. And high school graduates don't even get to apply.
I had a question for you, which was returning to the question of Christopher. One of the things that seems unbelievable, well, that may seem unbelievable about this film in the future, is that Eugene is still in a wheelchair. And we are always promised in the near future a moment in which a spinal cord injury is repairable. Here we have some in vitro technology that's allowing for the repair of quote-unquote defects before implantation, but not after. And so I wonder, from your perspective, does the shift from in vitro repair to postnatal repair, how does that change the conversation?
So how do you, I'm just trying to make sure I'm answering your question. So changing conversation in what ways? Or?
So this film is all about our histories we are determined at birth.
Right.
And there's no moment, we can only fall down, as in the case of Eugene, getting almost committing suicide. We can fall down from our destiny. But there is no notion that the body itself can be repaired. And I wonder, at one moment, we talked about the timelessness. At one moment you will look at this and say, oh, that's so quaint that he's still in the wheelchair. If that's the case, how does that change this film?
Yeah, so I think one of the more interesting subtle narratives of the film is that it is all about film where humans have the ability to propel themselves to the outer moons of various planets. But yet, as we're saying, we still don't have accessible buses, right? And so that dichotomy, I think, is striking, and it really highlights the fact that how technological development does not move on in its own direction. That is, that we make a series of political choices in terms of where to invest our time, energy, and resources. And so, surely, if we can propel people to the outer moons of various planets by whatever time this is occurring in Gattaca, we can come up with alternatives to make the world more accessible for people with disabilities. And so, I think that dichotomy that's present throughout the film just highlights how what we're actually engaged in is not simply a question about technological development, but about it's a question about how are we in a democracy going to decide how we use our time and resources in terms of making the world a better place for all citizens, and how that is by definition a political choice, not one where that kind of runs on its own volition with regards to technological development.
I think in the interest of time, we should shift now to the audience questions. If the audience don't have questions, I have a whole stack of more.
And I think that, not quite sure where to take that, but I think it is worth thinking.
Just to follow up, I saw a study that actually showed that Olympic bronze medal winners were much happier than silver medal winners because the bronze were just happy to get on the podium and the silvers were looking up to the person who had the gold.
Let me respond as well. The film, to me, was dramatic in the absence of any role of the public sector, of the government. There was nothing about the government either interceding or supporting this. It was all about the individual and his or her achievements, right? There was no social, collective response at any level. It was all about individuals.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I had the same realization in terms of the application of law. There's a line in there about how law is not taken seriously. Even though there are laws against type of discrimination, no one takes it seriously. But I think in addition to what you're saying in terms of the absence of government, it's also this kind of, the film's a transparent declaration of the role of the free market, right? Everything in the film is run by kind of free market individualism, as you're saying, Troy. And the idea that individuals compete and whatever the outcome that comes from that is the best outcome. And that's something that aligns strongly with eugenic ideologies, and that's something that has to be discussed and talked about.
I had a question in that regard. I mean, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act passed in 2008. But to a large degree, what is the effect of that been? I mean, when we engage with these private corporations, that skirts around it. Currently, one of our great fears is not our genetic information, but our social information, and how quickly we can be socially identified from just a few bits of the traces that we leave on the interwebs, and our entire loss of privacy in that regard. But I'm wondering, more specifically, has the landscape changed with the introduction of the Non-Discrimination Act?
Well, it was never the case that insurance companies could effectively make a determination because the technology was not there. So the laws about whether or not you can use genetics to discriminate or something about a futuristic moment. I mean, there are particular tests, as BRCA 1 and 2 and so forth, which can be used. But that's a very small part of the population. So I don't think the GINA laws really had a lot of impact. But I'm willing to hear others who have different opinions on this if there are.
Other questions?
I am a volunteer of Revolution Books, and thanks for showing this movie. And I appreciate it on many levels. One is artistic; it's a beautiful film. It is also fascinating because of the genetic technology. But my question is more around the third level. I think it's related to the first level. It's a good art, then it makes you think, particularly metaphorically, And I'm returning to a metaphor, I'm returning to the point Professor Duster made in the opening remarks about crossing categories, you know, about you talk about last several hundred years, you know, about how many changes happening, and then compared to before, you know. And I was thinking about metaphorically whether that is an intention of the director or not, or the filmmaker or not. This film shows that, in my thinking, not necessarily there's the filmmaker's thinking, right? See, I just finished attending last week the 3 days convention of the Kerner reports at Poly Ballroom, right? Okay. And there are most of people, speakers, professors, they actually point to basically it's the worsening of the situation compared to 50 years ago. The Kerner report doesn't make much impact at all in improving the lives around the black people, you know. And as one professor pointed out profoundly that racism against black people runs through everything in everyday life in America. So basically, I'm looking at the people in the ghetto. Basically, their life is pretty much, you know, set in dice. I mean, it's already set, you know. And so, I mean, one great thinker, Barbara Vakin, actually make a point like it is like a meat grinder. A lot of meat being ground out. Sometimes you have some spit out. My question I'm returning to is: do you think that film has that kind of meaning? That some people may be able to spit out, but most of those are falling into the meat grinder.
Well, the film really doesn't address the question of mobility very clearly. It makes it seem as if it's not possible, that because they have the technology to get your blood or your urine sample, they'll know exactly who you are, and you're locked in place. So the overarching framework of the film is that mobility isn't possible. Then you see at the very end a kind of hint of humanity, where the person who's been doing the testing actually understood that this was, quote, an invalid. So there's a kind of Hollywoodization, the romanticism of the individual in this film.
Just following on your point, one of the points though I want to make also is that the situation for disabled people hasn't improved. So 28 years after the ADA, the labor force participation and for disabled people has decreased. The incomes have not increased. Unemployment rates have increased. And so we think we are in this new moment when actually the situation has failed us. So we need to think about, this is not the moment right now, to think about how we construct our civil rights legislation so that we can actually improve the categories that we feel are important to us.
Well, that's actually related to my question, which was, especially since we've noticed that a film that's 20 years old has only gotten more relevant, do the panelists feel that Gattaca is inevitable? And if not, what sorts of activism do you think are necessary in order for it to be avoided?
Okay. The issue for me has always been what are the sources and forces of social mobilization and resistance. And there's nothing in this film which even points in that direction. There's no collectivity, there's no social force that's occupying the cognitive maps of anybody in this film. So the film doesn't take you there. What might, it seems to me, happen is that, as I think in the previous question, as you find in a society which is racialized and strong issues around gender inequality, you will find possibly resistance and mobilization around genetic determinism. That is, as the state, or even as individual corporations, 23andMe, move more and more in the direction of making a claim that this particular group is entitled to more or less, I do think there will be a reaction against it. I do think that mobilization comes in reaction to such developments. And whether or not, like my colleague Paul Ravenel used to talk about, which is that there'll be a biological basis of social categories, biosociality, and that this will be new and it will generate a different kind of mobilization. I'm less convinced of that, but I can see how one could go there. That a new technology, which calls part of this room a category, and another part another category, and gives access to one group or another, I think reaction is inevitable.
I think too we have a tremendous conflict or going on at this moment between the changes in the structure and the laws of, let's just say, the United States, but the world in general, over the last 30 years, which have given us a structure for inclusion and justice that 50 years ago we didn't have at all. And at the same time, we have been experiencing a greater standardization of people, or at least the value of people, that we know about. We know, for example, that the taller you are, the more money you will make. The people who, the slimmer you are, the more money you will make. The more you conform to what is understood as attractive at a particular moment, the more money you will make. And at the same time, we have greater implementation possibilities for inclusion and fairness than we have ever had before, from things like the Americans with Disabilities Act, or all sorts of inclusion legislation and practices. And both of these things are operating at the same time. So I would say that what we need to do is all of us figure out how to actually participate more in the possibilities for implementation of these structures that are actually there. And not try to imagine that there was a good old days that was a lot better than now, because those weren't good old days. And we don't want to fall into that kind of false nostalgia, but rather to make what we can of what we have now.
So, kind of at the climax of the movie, at one point, the main character said, I didn't ever stop because I didn't want to go halfway back. I'm kind of messing that up. But that moment where he says, oh, I never thought that I was going to have to turn around. And I personally kind of saw that messaging as a little bit martyristic and a little bit like, okay, because I have a disability, I'm expected to push myself to the point where I'm not sure I can get myself back. What do you make of that kind of messaging on behalf of films like these that are, kind of hopefully pushing back against eugenic ideals?
I read that scene a little bit differently. I think there are a lot of different ways to read it. I read it in the sense of, though he was considered an invalid and did not have traits that were selected for greatness, there were certain characteristics that cannot be selected for, right? And that for him it was courage, the idea that he had determination, that even though his brother had been selected for all the greatest attributes, the one thing that they couldn't select for, oddly enough, Jerome had. And so I read that as kind of a metaphorical statement, that idea that what makes a person great or what makes a society great is not necessarily these particular traits that we associate with greatness, such as height or swimming ability or other things, but rather it's these kind of internal things that are just a product of who we are as people.
And that was one of the problems with the movie, is that part of the message was that they weren't questioning the characteristics that made a person valuable. They were just saying that they got the wrong guy. That's right.
Excuse me. Yes, people have pointed out that there are a lot of conflicts and disparate views, and I'm thinking in public health now, the statement that your zip code is more important than your genetic code, or the epigenome is now where there's a lot of thinking. At the same time, NIH, I think, is still very enamored of genetics and this kind of research. But I would say right now people are talking about certainly the impact and the interrelation between the environment and the gene, and that is what's creating the phenotype. Any comments on that?
Well, I think that connects with the previous question to the extent that I think part of what you see this in the film, which is part of what made Vincent spectacular, particularly in this women's scene, was the idea that he was raised in an environment where he always had to fight harder than everybody else, which allowed him to achieve great heights. So it speaks to your point too that it's often inaccurate to think that that people's fates are determined by their genetic background or what traits they do or do not have. But we have to have a more holistic understanding of how the environment interacts to create people's abilities and outcomes.
Well, this is I'll try to make this less complicated than it is. It's a complicated answer. I use diabetes all the time as an example. Because in the last 30, 40 years, this country, India, I can name another 4 or 5 countries, have seen an extraordinary increase in diabetes. Okay? And the funding for diabetes research has gone remarkably over in the direction of genetics. So the poster child for diabetes, the Pima Indians. Why? 55% diabetes rate among the Pima at a certain age group. And so what do? The NIH funds research to go to the Pima, get their DNA, and look for markers. Now, those of us who are the other part of this equation in terms of environmental forces would say it's a transparent issue, that in 30 years you don't get a diabetes rate zooming up like this based upon genetics. It has to do with something called sugar and what happened at the end of the 1950s, right? So that's the sort of common sense version of this. But in science, there's a stratification system. And if you have a white coat lab person who can do work on your DNA, they have a kind of moral advantage when it comes to funding. And my concern has been for the last short period, how is it possible that an informed nation could spend so much money on the genetics of the Pima Indian, when in fact if you go back 110 years, the Pima, anthropological research on the Pima has shown this. In 1905 they had studies. The Pima had no diabetes. I said, zip. By 1940 it had gone up to about 12%, and it goes zooms straight up. That's not a genetic analysis. And yet the scientific imprimatur, the stratification system in science, means that environmentalists who talk about the diabetes get less of a shred.
We are running shorter on time. I think we'll take maybe one or two more questions. I just want to briefly say that the Sugar Council and the Farmer Council, who are co-sponsoring this talk, disavow all of the previous comments. Please take as much sugar as you can, and please take as much insulin as you can. Don't be sold outside at the Takia, you had a...
Well, I'll go after. So in thinking of the ways that this movie seems like kind of foreshadowing, and it's like a very foreboding, sort of intimidating future in which almost the system for explaining social inequalities is almost perfected. It's so completely deterministic that it's sort of unchallengeable. But the system that we have now, especially thinking of ideas about meritocracy, you have the individual who actually, the exception, proves the rule even more so. So when somebody succeeds despite all odds, that's actually incorporated into the logic of the system, saying like, yes, exactly, it works, and that's why they could break through against the odds. And that's something that we don't see in this film. It's sort of like, despite the evidence to the contrary that so many people are confronting, the success of Vincent, they realize that he's not supposed to be in this position, but they don't believe it. The brother almost swings himself to death for the second time. I guess my question is, I can't tell which system is necessarily more insidious. On the one hand, we have one that sort of dangerously kind of reincorporates the ways that we challenge the system into part of its logic. or this one that's sort of unconfrontable, unchallengeable, and sort of resistant to reality and truth?
Totally agree. Thank you for your comments. One thing that I just hadn't heard, well, that I saw in the movie was this idea of infiltration, because even within the question that you posed in the beginning, to think about if there were individuals who kind of resisted, or what their how did they participate or experience it? And the doctor who was fully aware that the individual was not, part of it, the collaboration with the Irene and Eugene, the human connection between the two of them. Even I saw the role of the brother as being an important driver in the way that the fake Jerome Vincent responded. So I just don't want to lose the opportunity to think about, although this is a very complex thing, in these kinds of environments, it seems just similar to what she said, we think of like this corporate power, privatization, even the usage and the manipulation of law and the legal system, and as a superpower that's beyond human or infiltration is impenetrable. And I don't want to leave out of here with that idea, right? There's like, I really appreciate what you shared about there being there are opportunities and structures in place. It's just about how informed are we in activating, being proactive rather than reactionary with creating the kinds of world that we want. And I just wanted to lift up and appreciate Osagie's comments about the power of human connection. Like, we really have to use the knowledge of what kind of frame and value system we really want to have and build in response, because I believe like corporations and privatizations and this crazy market logic that exists is still run by individuals. It's still human beings. I also do believe that some of this interesting work around the science, they do need to there's not enough diverse ideas of color and ideas of what it means to be a being within those companies. So I'm hoping that folks in here will get inspired to start knocking on doors and stuff.
Well, I think we have to close. I wanted to thank you, for all the shout-outs to the characters. I want to do one final shout-out to poor old Eugene, who ultimately is only good for his piss, his blood, and his hair, and he literally has to immolate himself. And my ending thought for you all is, what type of disability film is this? And the one character who really is disabled, ultimately his only resolution is immolation. David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder have talked about narrative prosthesis, about how disabled people become this crux on which films hinge. And so just a short moment of appreciation for Eugene, beautiful played by Jude Law, who unfortunately is an able-bodied person, and we can also go into that direction. On Thursday, we are having another set of conversations at the San Francisco Public Library, another panel, and that panel is composed of many people from the disability community, activist community in the Bay Area. It's going to be a whole different set of conversations, perhaps. And I hope if you have the opportunity that you can also attend that screening and discussion. But thank you everyone for coming.
I want to add my thanks to Karen. I'm Marcy Darnowski from the Center for Genetics and Society, and I wanted to also express some appreciation for the people who have made this event possible. It took the kind of work that these events work. So the people from the Oz Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, Takia Franklin in particular, the people from Center for Genetics and Society, during Caitlin and Jonathan running the mics, Katie Hassan and Kayla Talentino, and Charles Garzone, who all made this happen. And I want to thank the people from the Brower Center for working with us to improve their accessibility and for everything else they did for us and with us. And second, Karen's invitation to tell your friends and come yourselves to the conversation at the San Francisco Public Library on Thursday night, where that event is sponsored in addition to by Center for Genetics and Society and the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, the Superfest, International Disability Film Festival, and the Longmore Institute for Disability at San Francisco State, and the San Francisco Public Library itself. So all these organizations are really actually amazing organizations that are trying to bring a really sustained focus on issues of fairness, equality, social justice, inclusion, to a range of issues, including these genetic technologies. And at this CRISPR moment and this moment of DNA policing, these are really, really important issues for us to think about for democratic governance, for collective action, all that. So the last thing I just wanted to say is, besides keep in touch with all our organizations, there's newsletters, we would really value your support in many ways. The very last thing is about tonight. We have out in the lobby some very sugar-filled refreshments, lemonade and cookies to share with everyone. So I invite you to stay around and imbibe and eat and schmooze and all that kind of stuff. And also, if you can give some of your ideas and thoughts to the folks from Life of the Law, Miss Nancy and Tony are going to be here to talk with you about your thoughts for a future podcast on these questions. Thank you. Thank you very much.